Good day. I'm here with Randy Kay. My name's David Baldwin. We're going to have a little fireside chat about Randy's experience that he actually died and interacted with God. Pretty amazing story. He's written a book about it called Dying to Meet Jesus. It's a story that is worth telling. So Randy, give us the overview of what the experience was like for you.
David, I did not believe in near-death experiences until I had my own. I really have been involved in clinical work, leading a clinical team in neurology and cardiology, cardiovascular surgery. So I was scientifically based, fact-based, and
I often dismiss these types of stories. But what happened was, I cried out to God. You know, I was at a point where I felt broken and frustrated with God. And I screamed out in my bedroom, God, if you're there, show me. I need you to show up. I had just returned from a job interview with a major healthcare company on the East Coast. When I came back, my calf started hurting. I ignored it. I thought maybe it was from exercise. Maybe I strained it. So I let it go for several hours. I even went biking along the coast. We live in the San Diego area. But what should have been a relaxing ride became very difficult. My calf swelled to about 1.5 times its normal size. Again, I tried to justify it as just a pulled muscle. But it got so bad I couldn't go up the stairs. I have asthma, and my breathing is usually limited, but now it was extremely restricted. I couldn't even walk from the kitchen to the yard without gasping. When I tried going up the stairs, I could barely move my leg. At that point, I decided to see an orthopedic doctor. Just to get an anti-inflammatory, maybe some pain meds so I could go on the trip we had planned to the mountains with family. The doctor looked at my calf. It was nearly twice the size of my other leg. He said, "This clearly isn't normal." He pressed on my heel. It hurt terribly. Then he pressed on the ball of my foot and asked if that hurt. I said no, only the heel. He said, "Then it's not the muscle, because pressing the ball would affect the muscle. The heel pain? That's likely a deep vein." They sent me to the ER. I underwent a series of tests, including an ultrasound to check for blood clots. And sure enough, my entire right leg was filled with clots. 6 of them, not just one. They had traveled up into the upper leg. And here's the danger: clots that move can block arteries. Eventually, they reach the lungs and block the pulmonary artery, your main breathing vessel. That's why I was so out of breath. A CT scan confirmed it. My D-dimer levels, an anticoagulation indicator, were extremely high. Then the doctor walked in and said, "You were a walking dead man when you came in here." A life-threatening diagnosis. At that moment I thought, okay, I have 2 young children. I have a wife. We've already gone through some serious trials. I need to be there for them. But then the doctor told me something that hit me hard. Just a day earlier, a 27-year-old surfer, a young woman, had come in with the exact same issue. She had died. She had suffered what's called a pulmonary embolism, a blockage in the lungs that cuts off air supply. It's the 4th leading cause of sudden death. So the doctor said there were really only 2 options. 1. Rush me to UC San Diego, where a specialist could attempt to open my chest and surgically remove the clots. But he also said, "If we try that, you'll likely be dead before we get you there." So they opted for the second option. Pump me full of heavy-duty anticoagulants, blood thinners, and hope for the best. As they administered the meds, everything became a waiting game. During that time, the patient next to me was evacuated from the room. I later learned he had likely been infected with MRSA, a highly resistant and deadly bacterial infection. At the time, MRSA had a 20% mortality rate. So now I was facing 2 life-threatening situations: a body full of blood clots, and exposure to a potentially deadly infection. Then things got worse. The doctor came in to draw blood from my arm, but he couldn't get any. He said, "This is strange." Because my blood was clotting throughout my entire body. It was thickening and gelling faster than it could be drawn. Eventually, he got a small sample. But by then, my body had entered a full-blown crisis. I began convulsing. My limbs were flailing like a fish out of water. My heart went into arrhythmia. And then, it stopped. Cardiac arrest and the descent into darkness. At that point, when my heart stopped, everything went black. There's a 6-minute window between when the heart stops and when the brain shuts down. That's what doctors call brain death. And in that window, something extraordinary happened. There were no flashing lights. No tunnel at first. Just overwhelming darkness. A stillness that didn't feel peaceful, just blank. Normally, in a hospital, when your monitor flatlines, nurses and doctors rush in with code blue protocols. But I wasn't in the ICU. I was on the general ward because of the blood thinners they had me on. And the nurse had stepped out. The machine alarmed, my monitor flatlined, but there was no immediate response. So my heart remained stopped for about 30 minutes. Now, while the heart had completely shut down, the brain was still technically active for the first 6 minutes. And in that space, in that thin veil between life and death, something profound began to unfold. At first, I felt disconnected, as if I were floating in some unknown space. There was no fear, no awareness of where I was, just a numb, passive drift. Then, in the distance, something changed. I began rising. Literally, as if my essence, my consciousness, was being lifted upward. And as I ascended, I saw a light, soft at first, but growing stronger. And then I saw something that defied explanation, faint hills, glowing in the distance, and shadowy figures that looked like they were engaged in battle. They didn't look human. They seemed otherworldly, alien, almost. And for the first time, fear started to set in. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know what these figures were. But in that moment of uncertainty, I cried out the name of Jesus Christ. I didn't think about it. I just shouted his name. Even though I had been angry with God before this experience, even though I'd questioned him, I knew Jesus. And deep inside I believed. And the moment I called out his name, everything changed. Meeting Jesus face to face. When I called out the name of Jesus Christ, everything shifted. The fear disappeared. The distant battle faded. And then, he was there. I didn't need to be told it was Jesus. I just knew. There were no words spoken at first. There didn't need to be. It was as if every part of my spirit instantly recognized his presence. I wasn't just in a place, I was with a person. And that person radiated pure, unconditional love. My first thought was, so this is love. Not love like we experience it on earth, not romantic, conditional, or emotional. This was something entirely different. Jesus is love. God is love. And standing in his presence, I wasn't just being told I was loved, I was surrounded by it. It filled every part of me. I couldn't help but fall to my knees. But he lifted me up. And then he said 2 simple words. Trust me. Trust me. And in that moment I could feel everything. His beard, his face, the texture of his robe. He had brown hair. A beard. His appearance was familiar, Middle Eastern, like the images many of us grew up with in Sunday school. But more than how he looked, was how he saw me. When I finally turned and looked into his eyes, I saw something I'd never experienced before. They were brown olive, deep, and piercing. His gaze went straight through me, not in a judgmental way, but in a way that revealed everything. even the darkest parts of me. And yet, I didn't feel shame. I felt peace. I felt comfort I'd never known, not before, not since. It wasn't just spectacular, it was supernatural. There was no need for conversation. Our thoughts were in sync. I knew what he wanted me to know. He knew what I thought before I could say it. There was no need for language, because in his presence, everything was clear. Walking with Jesus in heaven. As I stood next to Jesus, he walked with me. Always close. Always with his arm around my shoulder. There was no distance between us, physically or spiritually. We weren't just walking, I was being guided, loved, known. And then, I looked around. I realized, this was heaven. Not in the metaphorical sense, this was literally paradise. I didn't need anyone to explain it to me. It was intuitive. I simply knew where I was. Just like I knew that he was Jesus, I knew that this place was home. Everything in heaven was alive. There was no decay. No death. Even the flowers seemed to breathe joy. And as we walked, I saw others, people. They were in villages, not in the architectural style of Earth, but interconnected communities that seemed to flow into one another. There was no separation or isolation. Everyone was connected. There was affection, unity, and a deep understanding among all. I saw my grandmother. She had passed years earlier, the only close family member I knew who had died. But I didn't see her the way I remembered her. I saw her as young, the way she looked in old photo albums. Radiant. Joyful. At peace. And then, I saw the river of life. It flowed like no river on earth, clear, brilliant, teeming with what I can only describe as divine energy. I didn't understand the biblical concept of the river of life until that moment. This was not symbolic. Nothing in heaven is metaphorical. Everything is literal and alive. This river flowed through everything, fields, mountains, even the villages. It was like it came from Jesus himself. Feeding, nourishing, sustaining all of heaven. I couldn't take my eyes off it. The colors, the vibrancy. There were shades of light and sound that don't exist on earth. I saw hundreds of hues of red, variations I had never imagined possible. Even the scents were unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Heaven was more real than this world. As if someone had lifted a veil, and I was seeing reality for the very first time. The angels of heaven and the power of joy. As I continued walking beside Jesus, I became aware of others around me, not just people, but angels. And let me tell you, they didn't look like us. Jesus appeared very human. Familiar. Someone you'd see walking down the street. But the angels, they were otherworldly. They stood tall, over 7 feet in height, with long limbs and features that were unfamiliar, yet majestic. Their skin had a copper-like tone, glowing with warmth and energy. Their eyes weren't like ours, they seemed to be made of fire, as if light itself burned inside them. And their voices. They didn't speak the way we do. When they spoke, it was as if multiple voices came out at once, resonating through the air with power and harmony. They were not terrifying, but they were awe-inspiring. It made me realize something I had never thought of before. I understood, for the first time, how Satan could have deceived angels. These celestial beings were so impressive, so commanding, that if someone like Jesus appeared next to them in humility, many might choose to follow the more dazzling form. But Jesus, he didn't need to prove anything. His power wasn't in appearance, it was in presence. And that presence overwhelmed everything else. Then I saw something I wasn't prepared for, pure joy. Not just a feeling. Joy was the atmosphere. There was no sorrow. No regret. no anxiety. Just joy that vibrated through every living thing. And it wasn't a superficial emotion. It was deep and intentional. People weren't just dancing or laughing, they were thriving in the presence of God. They were doing things, creative, active, purposeful things. But everything they did flowed from God's direction. There was no wasted movement. No wandering. Every action was worship. I remember asking Jesus, "What is the treasure in heaven?" And in that moment I realized, the treasure isn't golden streets or giant mansions. It's not the physical beauty. The treasure is proximity to God. Those who walked closely with Him on earth seemed to dwell closest to Him in heaven. The joy wasn't from getting rewards, it was from being near Him. And I knew this was everything we're made for. The people of heaven and the mystery of time. As I walked with Jesus, I noticed something remarkable about the people I saw in heaven. They looked different, not just physically, but spiritually. There were children, adults, and people of all ethnicities, but there was no division. No sense of separation. No judgment. Only unity. In this world, we often see people through the lens of race, status, or past. But in heaven, everyone radiated purpose and wholeness. I could still recognize different racial features, but they weren't barriers. They were reflections of God's creativity. I saw people interacting, working, even creating. But not in the way we toil here on earth. There was no burden or boredom. Everything was driven by joy and divine purpose. One woman caught my attention. She had long brown hair and stood with two men, one with curly black hair, the other with a small beard. They were holding hands. They weren't looking at Jesus, who stood beside me. But somehow, He was also among them. The woman prayed. She thanked the Lord. I could feel her prayer wasn't about herself. She was interceding for someone else, maybe someone still on earth. And I knew, heaven is active in prayer. Jesus didn't need to speak, His presence permeated all things. Every action, every thought, was synchronized with Him. He directed everything, not through commands but through presence. Then I saw something strange, linen-like layers descending, like veils falling softly from above. And people, angels, children, adults, danced and moved among them in pure delight. There was nothing accidental. Every movement was intentional, full of God's Spirit. Then came one of the biggest realizations of all. Time didn't exist. There were no clocks. No sunsets. No passing of days. Everything was eternal. Even though I was clinically dead for about 30 minutes. What I experienced felt like a lifetime, but without measurement. Time in heaven is not like time on earth. It's not even a concept. There is only now, and the now is full of God's glory. There was no darkness. But I did see something faint and distant. A swirling shape, like a funnel, very different from the rest of heaven. I asked Jesus about it. And He said it was the place I had passed through, the bridge between earth and heaven. It wasn't hell. It wasn't darkness. It was simply the transition. The butterfly and the purpose of returning. Just when I thought I would remain in heaven forever, something happened. A butterfly landed on my shoulder. Now I know how that might sound. But in heaven, nothing is random. Everything has meaning. The butterfly was unlike any I'd ever seen. Its colors were velvety and vibrant, like they were alive with light. I asked Jesus, "What does this mean?" And He gently explained, "This is a symbol of the wisdom I will give you, to guide you in your purpose on earth." Then He said the words I didn't want to hear. "I'm sending you back." I was devastated. Not afraid, but heartbroken. The only way I can describe it is like being a child on Christmas morning, just about to open your presents. And then being told, "Go back to bed. It's not time yet." I asked him, "Why?" "Your purpose is not yet fulfilled," he said. And I responded, "Then tell me what my purpose is. Because if I have to leave this paradise, I should at least know." But Jesus didn't give me a full answer. "If I told you everything," he said, "you would start to rely on yourself, instead of relying on me." That struck me deeply. Because I'm a type A personality, I want to plan everything. I'm not naturally someone who lives moment by moment. But Jesus was calling me to do exactly that. To trust Him daily. To live each moment with intentionality, relying not on my own understanding, but on His voice. He gave me an image. A man going to the barber on the wrong day, only to end up ministering to a grieving woman whose husband had just died. That, Jesus said, was His real purpose that day. In other words, it's not always about the big plans or goals. It's about listening to God's Spirit, even in the small, everyday moments. And as painful as it was, I understood. I had to go back. So I told him, "I love you." He held my hand. And that was the last thing I remembered. Until I woke up in my hospital room, back on earth. The pain of returning and the trials to come. I woke up in my hospital bed at Sharp Medical Center. And for a few moments, I was still overwhelmed by the presence of Jesus. But then the reality of this world hit me like a wall. My body was damaged. My legs were swollen and weak. My lungs had been scarred from the pulmonary embolism. My heart had been stopped for over 30 minutes. I needed months of recovery, both physically and emotionally. At first I thought, "Okay, I've had this incredible encounter. I've seen heaven. I've walked with Jesus. Now I'll go out and serve God. It'll be easy." But what followed was one of the hardest seasons of my life. Our daughter began suffering from multiple strokes. She couldn't remember her childhood. And then, she was raped. We were hit with nearly $500,000 in medical bills from my hospitalization. We faced financial ruin, emotional trauma, and overwhelming loss. I felt like Job. And I remember thinking, "God, I've done what you asked. I came back. I obeyed. Doesn't that mean I'm supposed to live in abundance now?" But instead, everything got harder. It felt unfair. It felt like God owed me a peaceful life after all I'd gone through. But Jesus had warned me in heaven. There will be trials. And now, I understood why. He wasn't punishing me. He was equipping me, because I now had a trust in Him I never had before. Before my near-death experience, I doubted. I questioned God's goodness. But after meeting Him, after feeling His love, seeing His eyes, and walking with Him in heaven, I knew I could never again question who He is. He's real. He's good. He's sovereign, even when life doesn't make sense. So now, in the middle of pain and loss, I knew one thing for sure. He was with me. And because of that, I could keep going. A new mission, helping others heal. As I recovered, I started to understand what Jesus meant when He told me, "Your purpose is not yet fulfilled." It wasn't about success. It wasn't about achieving something grand in the world's eyes. It was about helping people heal. Jesus had shown me a kind of love, peace, and joy that I couldn't keep to myself. He had walked me through heaven, not to show off paradise, but to equip me for a broken world. And that became my calling. I began sharing my story, on podcasts, in churches, and eventually in my book, Dying to Meet Jesus. But even more than telling people about heaven, I started helping them face their pain. Because here's what I learned. Most people don't need a theology lesson. They need hope. They need to know that their pain has purpose. I now walk with people who are grieving, those who've lost children, spouses, or battled terminal illness. And I tell them, heaven is real. Jesus is real. And you are not alone. I remind them that nothing is wasted. Not a single tear. Not a single moment of suffering. Everything we endure here, God redeems it all. I used to think the abundant life Jesus promised was about comfort. Now I understand it's about being filled with His Spirit. Regardless of what's happening around me, there are really only two responses to suffering. You can run away from God, blame Him, resent Him, try to find peace in other things. Or you can run toward God, be honest, be raw, be broken, and find that He's already waiting. The abundant life is not about what you have, but about who you have, and if you have Jesus, you have everything. That's my mission now. To help people walk through grief, trauma, and loss, and find Jesus in the middle of it. The eternal reward, what heaven teaches us about God's heart. In heaven, there's no pain. There's no confusion. Only joy, wholeness, and overwhelming peace. But the most powerful truth I brought back with me is this. God longs to be with us. The only moment I sensed sorrow in Jesus was when He looked toward those who had rejected Him. That was the only time I saw grief on His face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't condemnation. It was heartbreak. And in that moment, I understood something very clearly. God's greatest desire is not to punish us, it's to redeem us. He wants to be with His creation. He wants intimacy, not distance. The Bible says, Jesus wept. And I saw that emotion in heaven. Not because He was disappointed in humanity, but because so many of His children live apart from Him, by choice. Jesus doesn't force Himself on anyone, but He pursues every soul with relentless love. And heaven? It's not just a reward for the good. It's the home of the redeemed. The greatest treasure there isn't mansions, gold, or beauty. The greatest treasure is nearness to God. Those who walked closely with Him here on earth will walk even closer with Him there. Their suffering? It's not forgotten. It's rewarded. Every loss we endure, every trial, every tear, is met with divine restoration. Nothing is wasted in heaven. So to anyone who is hurting, doubting, or grieving, keep going. You are seen. You are loved. And you are not alone. Heaven is real. Jesus is alive. And the closer you draw to Him now, the deeper your joy will be in eternity. Final reflections, a message for those still searching. After I came back from heaven, people would ask me, was it real? Couldn't it have just been your brain shutting down? Are you sure it wasn't just a dream? And I always respond with this. If it was just a dream, then how did it change everything about me? Because I came back from that experience with a clarity I never had before. A peace that didn't come from this world, and a mission I never planned for. I used to live for success, control, recognition. Now I live to tell others that there is more. There is a home beyond this life. And a God who longs to bring you there. If you're watching this and you've lost someone, I want you to know they are not lost. If they knew Jesus, they are more alive now than they ever were here. If you're battling with depression, doubt, or trauma, I've been there. I know what it's like to question God, to scream into the silence, to feel abandoned. But here's the truth. God is not absent in your suffering. He is present, waiting for you to turn to Him. And maybe you're skeptical. Maybe you don't believe in heaven, or God, or any of this. That's okay. Jesus isn't afraid of your questions. But what he is longing for is your heart. He wants to walk with you, just like he walked with me. He wants you to know his love, not just in eternity, but right now. If you're wondering whether life has meaning, whether your pain has purpose, whether God sees you, let me assure you, yes, he does. He saw me when I was broken and angry. He met me in my darkest moment. And he brought me back with one message. Trust me. You are not forgotten. You are not alone. And I'm not done with you yet. So I share this not to sensationalize, not to impress, but to tell you, heaven is real. Jesus is real. And he loves you more than you can possibly imagine.